What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. My name is Hart. Today, I'll be breaking down the two-game Monday Night Football slate. We have the Eagles versus the Buccaneers, and then we have the Rams versus the Bengals. So, should be a great slate for tonight. 500K up top to first place here on DraftKings. I'll be talking through a potential lineup build for you guys, my favorite core plays, some other picks, all the good stuff in this breakdown. So, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe, and let's get into it. So, starting off here, let's take a quick look at the game totals and the spreads. So right now for the Eagles and Bucks, 5-point spread, 44.5 game total, and then Rams versus Bengals, 3-point spread, 44.5 game total. So about the same for both. So diving into this slate here, we'll start with the quarterbacks. I think Jalen Hurts is by far the best player, and it's obviously everyone knows that. But in terms of quarterbacks, he's by far the safest option and the best option, just in terms of his upside. So for passing, obviously he has the ability to go for 300 plus yards. He hasn't yet, just because against a tough New England defense, only threw for 170, and then against Minnesota, was pretty efficient, 18 of 23. It's just more so that he was able to, a few penalties got them to the goal line, and he was able to just do some QB sneaks there. And also, DeAndre Swift was absolutely tearing up the Vikings there. So they were just really reliant on the run, didn't have to pass it a lot. So that's kind of why his passing numbers were down the first 2 weeks. But he's one of those guys that we know who can throw for 250, 300 plus yards, a couple touchdowns, and he has the ability to get those tush pushes, the QB sneaks, which are pretty much unstoppable there in the red zone. So massive upside. Safest quarterback play. Going to be probably the most popular quarterback, but for good reason. Joe Burrow is probably going to play. We'll have to wait and see. He's going to try to play. Now, my issue here with Joe Burrow is that he could play. He could be fine. He could play. He can flare up and really screw you by missing a few quarters, or he could play, or he could intend to play, and then he could be a healthy scratch right before the slate starts. And at that point, you're really screwed because it's like depending on how you built your lineup, you'd maybe get to be able to get to Stafford, or you'd have to drop down to Jake Browning at 5,000, and it just you're screwed at that point unless Jake Browning really goes off. But that's hard to imagine there. Just a backup QB coming in and doing that. So there's a lot of risk with waiting for Joe Burrow and going with him. But maybe doing that, maybe he comes in at very low ownership compared to a guy like Stafford and Jalen Hurts and even Baker Mayfield. So it might be worth it. So I just say wait and hold. Kind of hopefully we get more news throughout the day if he's going to play. Because otherwise you might have to take that option of do I get risky and go with him, or do I go with the safer route with going like a Stafford or a Jalen Hurts? That's kind of the coin flip there with Burrow. But if he's good to go and you like him, I think he's a very solid option. Throwing the ball a ton, just the offense hasn't been able to get anything down so far. So just know it comes with a lot of risk there for Joe Burrow. For Stafford, I do really like Stafford. I mean, he's going to be a popular play. He's very cheap. He's thrown the ball a ton of times, 38, 55. He hasn't gotten the touchdowns there through the air. 334 yards, 307 yards, only one touchdown through 2 games, but he's absolutely airing the ball out. So I do think he's a great option coming in at that price tag in Cincinnati. So he'll be a very popular play as well. Baker Mayfield will be more of a contrarian play. He's throwing the ball a decent amount, but you got to pump the brakes a little bit. He's looked good, but it's been against the Minnesota Vikings and the Chicago Bears, two of the worst defenses and teams in the league right now. And he only put up 16 and 21. So I'm not saying he can't go out there and have a great game. The Eagles are more of like a pass funnel defense, so he should be able to throw the ball a decent amount. They should probably be down, so they'll probably have to throw the ball even more. So that suits up well for him. He's a guy that can, rush the ball a tiny bit. It's just, hard to trust him against this defense. I'd rather go to the safer options of Stafford or Hurts or even Burrow compared to Baker for me personally. And then Jake Browning, if you want to get super contrarian, you can definitely go down to him. For the running back situation here, Joe Mixon, it's really dependent on Joe Burrow. If Joe Burrow's in, I think I'd rather get to Mixon then. If Burrow's out, I do think more people will go to Mixon just because they'd probably assume the Bengals will try to run it more with Jake Browning in at quarterback. So that's kind of my issue there with Mixon. I don't love him right now. It's just the Joe Burrow really muddies the waters for me personally on what I want to do with the Bengals right now. So I'm kind of waiting for more information from that camp in that area to see if I'm going to add any Bengals into my lineup now, or if I'm just going to completely fade the Bengals. Rashad White, great. It just for Rashad White, going up against this Eagles defense, more of a pass funnel defense, so it's gonna be hard for him to be efficient in the run game, and he really hasn't been the first 2 games. Against 2 terrible defenses. Only 39 yards against Minnesota and only 73 against the Bears. But the great thing is he's involved in the passing game. As you can see, 2 targets and 5 targets. I mean, he got 19 opportunities in week 1 against Minnesota. He got, 23 in week 2 against the Chicago Bears. I think we expect around 20 opportunities once again for Rashad White. He's heavily involved in the passing game. There'll be a lot of checkdowns from Baker to him. So I think it's a very solid option there at 5,900. In terms of the Eagles running backs, Kenneth Gainwell is back, so it's Swift and Gainwell. It'll be very interesting to see kind of what they do in terms of the snap count here. So week 1, Kenneth Gainwell played about 70%, 60% of the snaps. Swift played about 30, and then the rest of the other 10% went to Boston Scott. Obviously, Kenneth Gainwell did not play week 2. DeAndre Swift did, and he played 90% of the snaps, pretty much played the whole game there, and obviously had like a career game. So it'd be very interesting to see what happens in week 3 here. So we know the Eagles like to run multiple running backs, but we really haven't seen the situation where, they started off with Kenneth Gainwell as their main back week 1, and then he was out week 2. DeAndre Swift has career week. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens here with the running game, especially going against this Tampa Bay defense, another team that's, pass funnel defense where they stop the run and they just want you to beat them by passing the ball. So it might be a hard slate here for Swift and Gainwell in terms of just rushing upside. And for that reason, I think I slightly prefer Kenneth Gainwell to Swift just because they do like to target him a little bit more in the passing game there. They will give him rushes as well. So, and he's cheaper. And so that's really it for me. I like that. Just the opportunity there with just the passes, the targets out of the backfield. Because if they do go down or if they need to, get some passes out of the backfield going, I think they do prefer going to Gainwell over Swift. And there is no Boston Scott. He's out. So I think that's kind of my thought process there. I do really like Swift. It's just one of those things. Tampa Bay is great at stopping the run there. With was it Vita Vea in the middle. So it'll be interesting to see kind of how they attack this Tampa Bay defense in terms of the run. But I think it'd be viable to even play both guys if you want to get super different on this slate. In order to take down the 500K to first, I don't mind playing both guys because they both should get a decent amount of run. I wouldn't be surprised if it's closer to like 50-50 split for both of them tonight. And I think it'd be a great way to get different is by running both Kenneth and Swift. If you do that, I don't know if I'd go with Hurts. It's just a lot there in terms of like running back attack because Hurts also has that rushing upside and he could, vulture those goal line touchdowns. But if you did all three, that'd be very contrarian. But I think I'd prefer, if you did both, going to like a Stafford or like a Burrow. Kyron Williams, going to be an absolute lock for me just because he saw 95% of the snaps in week 2. 95%. That's almost unheard of. Just did not use any of the backup running backs. And he saw 14 attempts and 10 targets out of the backfield against a very solid San Fran defense. And he put up 28 fantasy points, 17 the week before. I mean, it's just, it's hard to argue. I mean, he won't get 95%, but even if he gets 70% or more, it's just like he's getting a ton of attempts, ton of targets. Really like him. Going to be super popular, but for good reason. He's seen a ton of opportunities. Going on down here, Boston Scott, as I mentioned, is out. Travion Williams is the backup running back to Joe Mixon. I just don't think there's a need to get to any of these backups unless you're really hoping for one of them to kind of just vulture a touchdown in the red zone. If that happens, I still don't even think that's enough to get into the winning lineup because they're not that cheap compared to the main running back. So I don't think there's a need to pay down to any of these backup running backs here for either side. And I will mention Ronnie Rivers is kind of the running back to Kyron Williams. So maybe he gets a little bit more run, but still, I just don't think there's a need to pay down at running back. For the wide receiver situation here, Jamar Chase, as I mentioned, it's really hard to trust the Bengals right now in terms of like what's going to happen with Joe Burrow. Because if it's Jake Browning, I really have a hard time trusting him throwing the ball to both Chase and T. Higgins. I think one of them is going to be left out, and I think it might be Higgins. So the Bengals more so are a wait and see approach for me. Hopefully we get some more news there. But Jamar Chase, I mean, if there is Burrow, I like him. He really hasn't had a breakout game yet, and he's going against the Rams. It should be just an air raid offense by both teams. So if Burrow's in, I do really like Chase. If he's out, I guess you can go to Chase as like a very contrarian play there. I do think his ownership will be very minimal if there is no Burrow, just because it's hard to trust Jake Browning. But kind of my thought process there for him. AJ Brown, just an absolute lock and load for me, especially after the last game. He was, very vocal on the sidelines about wanting the ball. Obviously week one, 10 targets, 7 for 79, didn't get a touchdown. Week two, only saw six while Devontae Smith went off, caught four for 29 yards. So very vocal. He wants to be involved. I expect them to heavily involve him in the game plan starting off this game. So really, really like AJ Brown. Pairing him with Jalen Hurts looks really, really solid. Devontae Smith, I don't mind. A lot of people are going to run, Jalen Hurts, AJ Brown, Devontae Smith stacks, which I think is solid because they're both playing 90+% of the snaps. As you can see, Devontae Smith is more of the big play wide receiver there, and he's had really, really strong 2 weeks. So yeah, I mean, it's viable to play both of them. I think it's a very solid option there. So I do like those Eagles wide receivers a lot, but it will be a very popular take. Puka, I mean, it's hard not to lock and load him. I mean, thank God I have him in all my fantasy teams. I was able to pick him up after week one just in case to see what happens in week two. And I played him in 2 out of 3, and it was great. It was great. I mean, 15 targets in 20, absolutely insane. 35 targets 2 weeks. Wild, wild stuff here. Once again, I expect him to be heavily involved. I mean, they love him. I don't know if we can expect 15 and 20 targets, but I'd say more so around 10. Even so, I mean, that's a great amount for a guy who's only 6,400 and a very pass heavy offense. In terms of the receivers for Tampa Bay, I do think a lot of them will be very, decently contrarian just because, it's it's Baker Mayfield. But I think a lot of more people will go to Godwin over Evans, but we'll have to wait and see. Evans is more of like the big play wide receiver. It seems like he's doing pretty slow, but he's been going off 10 targets, 8 targets. So it's really like what we're seeing there from him. But he has gotten 2 touchdowns. So maybe the TD variance comes down a little bit for him. T. Higgins, as I mentioned, I think he's a solid contrarian play. It really just comes down to what happens with Joe Burrow. But I do think the Bengals will be probably the most contrarian on the slate right now. And until we get those news about Joe Burrow. Tutu Atwell will be a very popular play. 9 targets, 8 targets. He's kind of gone under the radar because of Puka and how well he's been doing. But I mean, as you can see, 8 targets, 6 for 119, 20 fantasy points. 9 targets the next game, 7 for 77, and 15.2. So it's like Tutu is a great, great option there, 5,000. Another very, very popular play, but for good reason. They're just airing the ball a ton there for the Rams. So he looks really solid. I don't mind getting to Justin Jefferson, or excuse me, Van Jefferson. 5 targets, 4 targets. So he's not heavily involved right now, but he's kind of like a big play wide receiver. Like he's seen enough targets. He's playing a ton of snaps. So I think he's very viable at 3,900 if you want to get different from Puka and Tutu Atwell. Boyd, same thing. He wide receiver 3 here. Saw 8 targets last game. I do think he could be more involved, especially if Jake Browning's QB. He could look to check down to Boyd in the slot wide receiver position. So I think he's viable. I don't mind him. Trey Palmer, interesting. The Bucks have been running like 4 or 5 wide receiver sets. He saw 2 targets. He's playing a decent amount of snaps, about 30% of the snaps. It's just 3,100. I don't know if I can trust him enough there. Rashad White, Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, even Cade Otton, they're all ahead of him in the pecking order. So he'd just be more so of a very cheap option, kind of a lineup value saver there if you want to go to him at 3,100. Zacharias will be kind of wide receiver 3 there for the Eagles. I guess you could take a shot on him. Quez Watkins is out, so he'll be wide receiver 3, but they will mix in a little bit of Kobe, but I don't know if either one are a necessity to get to for wide receivers. And then for the tight ends, Dallas Goedert looks great. Had a nice bounce back game in terms of targets. Only saw 1 week 1, saw 7 week 2, 6 for 22. Not a ton there in terms of his output, but I still think he's a very solid play there, just in terms of the tight end position. Same with Higbee. Higbee played about 90% of the snaps. Saw 3 targets week 1, 7 week 2. I think in that offense, I do think we expect him to get the ball even more so this week. So I think it's a solid option, a pivot play off of Tutu or Puka. I do really like Higbee for tonight. Same thing with Cade Otton. He'll be very popular. He's cheap, 3,000, and he saw a decent amount of targets week 2 against the Bears. Saw 6, caught 6 for 41. He's a great dump off option for Baker Mayfield. So I expect him to be heavily involved. He's playing a good amount of the game as well. They are splitting the snaps there with some other tight ends, but he's pretty much the main pass catching tight end there for Tampa Bay. So looks great there. And then obviously the big news is Ish Smith Jr. is doubtful. With him being out, we can look to Drew Sample. He'll probably get the fill in there. He's a solid pass catching tight end there. So 2,500. He'd be more so of like a red zone threat, but Drake Browning, if he does play, you could look to him a decent amount. So I think keep your eyes peeled for him. But Drew Sample is a nice solid option at 2,500. And they will split some snaps with Mitchell Wilcox. I prefer getting to Sample over Wilcox just because Sample is a little bit more um, viable just in terms of they like to go to him already. So, he'll be more viable than Wilcox, but they're both there. And that's really it for the tight end situation. So to fill out this lineup, 4,400 left over for defenses. Eagles are obviously going to be the most popular. Um, I like them all besides the Bengals pretty much. I guess every defense is viable. It really comes down to ownership for defense. All you really need is that like pick six or defensive touchdown. I think in terms of odds, I think obviously the Eagles stand out the most, but I think every single team is viable. Yeah, that's kind of my thoughts there. It's just hard to trust the Bucks going against that Eagles defense, but Jalen Hurts is turnover prone. They could get something lucky there. But for now, let's just go with like the Rams. We'll just throw them in there. 5,900 or about 5K left over. Let's go to the tight ends real fast. I do like throwing in Higby there. Wide receivers about 5,200 left over. We can go to let's just throw in Godwin. Don't mind that. 4,700 left over here. And we can go to not a great range, having 4,700 left over. I guess we could do we can throw in Van Jefferson if we want. But we already got two Rams wide receivers, basically. Let's just throw in a K down. So obviously, 1,700 left over. You can pay up or pay down for some other positions. But we got Hertz. We got AJ Brown there. We have a nice stack there. We have a bring back with Chris Godwin. I do like the Kenneth Gainwell play as well. Kyron Williams is pretty much a lock. But in terms of like my core plays, here's a potential lineup. But in terms of core plays, I think right now it is going to be Hertz, Kyron Williams, AJ Brown, and Puka. So nothing obviously crazy or contrarian, but I think that's just a really good start to your lineup there. Hertz, Kyron, AJ Brown, Puka. Just in terms of opportunities and upside, I think they're all probably the highest on the slate so far. Once we get that, Joe Burrow news, we can kind of go from there. But this is kind of what I'm leaning towards building my lineups for tonight. So I hope you guys like the video. Hit the like button. I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.